Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 2021 conference of the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program. My name is Rob Pirani. I'm the director of the Estuary Program. Every year, the program staff of the Hudson River Foundation work with our many HEP partners to create this gathering. It's a key opportunity to advance the shared mission of our collaboration, bringing the benefits of the Clean Water Act, fishable and swimmable waters, to the people and wildlife of the estuary. This week, we're thrilled that more than 460 community leaders, managers, educators, scientists, advocates, and policymakers will be participating in the conference. We're sad, of course, that we're once again not gathering in person and able to see you face to face, but we're grateful for your attendance and especially for your commitment to our shared waters. I want to especially recognize and thank the HEP leadership on our policy and management committees and the many members of the citizens and science advisory committees and technical work groups. These are the people who make HEP work and ensure that we are making progress towards the shared priorities of our common action agenda. You can learn more about the commitment of our core partners by checking out some great video messages from Walter Mugden, the acting administrator from US EPA Region 2, as well as from the leadership at the Army Corps of Engineers, New York District, New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I also want to call out and thank the people who put together this year's conference and will make the whole week work. Our planning committees members, Lingard Knudsen, Wayne Jackson, and Peter Brandt from EPA, Rob Buchanan from Billion Oyster Project, Allison Fitzgerald from New York City University and Baykeeper, Shino Tanakawa from the New York City Soil and Water Conservation District, and Audrey Van Hayten from New York State Department of Health. Our friends at Billion Oyster Project and Natural Areas Conservancy helped organize a couple of partner panels. And of course, the Hudson River Foundation staff, who have been really the backbone of this effort, Isabel Stinnett, our intrepid conference organizer, as well as Liz Baladaris, Emma Blackford, and Jim Lodge. You're going to hear from two other contributors, Rosana Silva and John Kramer, in a minute. Our conference theme this year is all about finding new ways to connect to our waterfront communities, how to help bring people to the waterways, both figuratively and literally, and best enable them to participate in and advance decisions about estuary management. It's a topic that's always been critical to HEP and the foundation, but it's more important now than ever as we face key challenges of this moment, addressing the threats posed by the climate crisis and moving towards environmental justice. As you all know, our federal and state leaders have been putting unprecedented attention and resources towards these two issues. The federal infrastructure bills that will direct billions of dollars towards upgrading our energy, water, and other infrastructure, including important measures to enhance coastal resiliency, and the federal and state policies that are focusing new attention and deserved attention to the issues in environmentally overburdened communities. The key question for HEP and all of our partners is whether this estuary and our waterfront communities will be ready to take advantage of these opportunities. Working with our conference committee and partners, we have put together a full week's worth of content that can help us get ready to tell our stories about the importance of fishable, swimmable waters. From author Paul Greenberg's opening talk in just a few minutes about how fish stories can connect people to our waterways, to our closing keynote Thursday from New Jersey Congressman Tom Malinowski, a leader who's going to talk to us about the promise of the recent infrastructure bills. There are more than 14 presentations, panel discussions, and interactive workshops for you to take part in. And they feature some great speakers that will help you make the connection between ecosystem health and public engagement. And here to tell you a little bit more about the week's agenda and how to take advantage of all that it offers via the HUVA platform is Rosana De Silva, the Water Quality Manager for the Harbor Estuary Program and the Hudson River Foundation. Rosana?
Thank you, Rob. Just gonna share my screen real quick. All right, good morning, everyone. So HEP's Water Quality Work Group works towards addressing the complex water quality issues of the estuary and aid in facilitating discussions and communications across multiple jurisdictions, including 2 states, a dozen major utilities, and hundreds of local governments. For the last 2 years, the Water Quality Work Group has been working on a joint harbor report that combines water quality data collected throughout the harbor by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection and the New Jersey Harbor Dischargers Group, with a goal to understand and communicate how far our shared waters far from achieving the Clean Water Act's goal of fishable, swimmable. Released earlier this year, the report is just one portion of our shared water quality objective, where we are working towards sharing clear and easy to understand water quality information with the public, focusing on issues and uses around public health, the potential public health risks. Recognizing that data can only go so far, we are thrilled to dedicate this conference to waterway stories. The conference agenda will specifically help advance the Water Quality Work Group's effort in developing water body and watershed-specific briefs and connect local relevant information into easy, digestible stories on potential public health risks and how agencies and organizations are working to eliminate or minimize these risks. Our conversations this week is designed to help all of HELP's partners up their game when it comes to engaging people in the importance of our waterways and its management. After our morning keynote, be sure to join us for several sessions today. At 11 a.m., Who Speaks for the Waterways will discuss elevating the voice of the community to improve our waterways and stewarding our waterways to highlight issues in the community. After a half-hour break, we'll come back for an interactive training at 1 p.m. that will explore modern outreach concepts to help you predict the number of people who will notice your message and how to measure their response. And we'll come back at 3 p.m. for our last session of the day, Designing for Co-Benefits, that will explore unique projects that seek to improve water quality while also maximizing co-benefits. We have a number of sessions happening throughout the rest of the week till Thursday, November 18th. To highlight just a few more, we'll start tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with the launch of the Safe Space Commitment, a new coalition where we are inviting all partners to take the pledge to work towards creating open and equitable environments within our shared spaces where everyone can feel safe and welcome. We'll end tomorrow with an old story made new at 4 p.m. to learn about historic and current initiatives to provide safe and accessible recreation on our waterways. Wednesday morning, we have 2 partner sessions followed by fishing. Come and spend time with some fisher folk as they discuss lessons learned from being on the water and the ways we can work together to improve communication with and about our fishing community during Creating Community with Every Catch at 12:30. And finally, Thursday, join us at 10:30 to discuss the flow of trash and the efforts to improve our understanding of floatable debris pathways into the estuary. As Rob mentioned, we'll be celebrating the end of our conference week on Thursday at 12:30 with Congressman Tom Malinowski of New Jersey to discuss the recent congressional action on water infrastructure and the climate crisis. And for those of you unfamiliar with Whova, I want to just go over a few quick tips. Whether you are joining in on a web browser or the Whova app, check out the Whova guides. These guides provide quick videos to show you how to navigate the platform and go over some frequently asked questions. Your homepage will include the welcome screen and activity feed to the right, and most importantly, the navigation tabs to the left. The agenda for the full week can be found on the tab to the left, where you will be able to toggle between days and add sessions to create your own agenda. Similar to this morning, to access the session, you will click on View Session at a allotted time to join live. And once in the session, you will be able to participate on this screen. You will notice that on the right, you have the option of Q&A, polls, chat, and community. We encourage that all questions for our panelists to be submitted in the Q&A, and any discussion or comments, please use the chat. HEP staff will be on and available during each session to help you if you're experiencing any technical issues. First, try to refresh your screen. If that doesn't work, try to exit out of the web browser or the app and reopen Whova. You can also click on Community and then click on Ask Organizers Anything board, and we'll be sure to help you there with any technical issues that you're experiencing. The community board is another great place to continue the conversation throughout the week, and it's also accessible in your navigation tab to the left. And lastly, to be sure to scroll down in each session to find the subsessions for each session, to find subsessions for each videos. At your leisure, we invite you to watch and listen short stories related to each session, and you can also find those under resources and click on video gallery. Now I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of the Hudson River Foundation, Jonathan Kramer.
Thank you, Rosana. This morning, I have the great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the noted environmentalist and writer, Paul Greenberg. As I thought about what I might say today, I was drawn to the question of why storytelling is so important for all of us. The stories we tell and the way we tell them are essential to who we are as individuals and to how our organizations present their missions to the world. These stories are tangible examples of what we care about and what drives us. They connect us to the communities that we are part of and to those we want to serve. They connect us to the world around us, the harbor, the estuary, and the river. I was trained many years ago to be a scientist, to study freshwater, estuarine, and marine systems. Back then, the stories I told came from the perspective of a researcher, one who was trying to add knowledge to our collective understanding of places like Chesapeake Bay and the Sargasso Sea. For better, or most likely for worse, my stories were told in a formal language, and especially with numbers and statistics, conforming to the highly structured conventions that shape most scientific discourse. Powerful in many ways, but so often inaccessible to those outside that world. Over time, I moved on from thinking and telling stories about discovery to thinking much more about how that knowledge could be made more useful and ultimately used. That notion of useful knowledge really forced me to think not just about what we communicate, but how we communicate. To ask if scientific knowledge can be explained in ways that can help communities, managers, and policymakers understand the complex world we live in and the trade-offs that make decisions at the border of social and environmental systems so difficult. I've been chasing those questions for the past 20 years since I stopped being an active researcher. I'm still relatively new to my current role at the Hudson River Foundation, but over the many years I've been involved with this organization, I've come to deeply admire the stories it has been able to tell, and especially the ways that it tells them. The Foundation's 40-year history of bringing science to the complex issues that drive change in the Hudson is one that we are rightly proud of. For me, this ecosystem is very much about all those tightly coupled interactions between human communities and the natural world. Social and environmental systems are never separate. Finding the right balance at this interface is essential if we are to achieve sustainable outcomes. That challenge is key to our future here in the Hudson and well beyond. The need to be successful in meeting this challenge becomes more urgent every day. Central to the mission of the Foundation is helping the research community create new knowledge. We have done that through 4 decades of funding exceptional science and providing support for generations of researchers to engage with us. We've consistently played the role of neutral convener to bring scientists, managers, and policy makers together to discuss, debate, and synthesize what we know, and especially what we need to know. In doing that, we've helped to define a knowledge ecosystem of sorts with a distinct focus on use-inspired knowledge. The Harbor Estuary Program, with its remarkable staff, are an integral and immensely important part of all that we do at the Foundation. Their individual and collective work and their insights inform all we do. Working together, we are more connected to communities and are not just funders of science, but trusted partners in the pursuit of solutions. This is why storytelling is so important to the Hudson River Foundation. What we have learned over these many years is that our voice has to take into account some fundamental truths. How a story is shaped, the process to get to that narrative truly matters. Who shapes that process? The people in the room, their ways of knowing, their scientific disciplines, and their lived experiences matter. A commitment to fact and recognizing both what is known and the limitations of our knowledge matters, as does a willingness to convey that shared knowledge in an honest and timely way so that it can be considered by decision makers of all kinds. So why am I telling you all this? Because at a time when building understanding is critical, when conveying that understanding with the clarity of context and fact is essential, our keynote speaker is an important contributor. As we think about how to convey our information and knowledge in ways that are both authentic and credible, it's important to look for inspiration from those whose voices are clear and grounded. Paul Greenberg is surely one of those consequential individuals we need to pay attention to. Paul is writer in residence at the Safina Center, an adjunct professor at NYU, and has been a visiting scholar at the University of Washington. He's a graduate in Russian studies from Brown University. When not writing, he's a contributor to both national television and radio, including producing documentary content for PBS's Frontline program and appearing on NPR's Fresh Air. His exceptional TED Talk has reached over 1.5 million viewers to date. He's been the recipient of a Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation, a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, a James Beard Award for Writing and Literature, and many other honors. Over the course of his prolific career, Paul has written numerous articles and published 6 books, including the bestseller For Fish, American Catch, The Omega Principle, and The Climate Diet. In each, he explores the intersection, as he says, of environment and technology. What lies at the heart of this very successful career? Well, to answer that question, you need only to open one of his books. In doing so, you quickly realize you are in exceptional hands. Look at the opening chapter of American Catch. It's the story of the eastern oyster in New York, and it chronicles what's happened to the once great populations of this vital bivalve, from the time when it was a valued delicacy to the current day when sustainable populations are an aspiration rather than a reality. As you begin to read, you immediately feel the tug of the narrative. Paul brings the voices of characters big and small into this story, some of whom I'm sure are listening to this talk today. He brings facts and perspectives to the loss of the species and the efforts of those working against big odds to bring it back. His narrative is also heartfelt, making it all the more meaningful. Read the chapter on tuna in For Fish. The dialogue among the paying customers looking to hook a tuna on the fishing boat Explorer would have fit in any great novel, and the action was compelling as an adventure story. But we're soon learning about these magnificent fish, their incredible abilities to cruise faster than modern battleships, and how evolutionary adaptations make them so prized as the food fish, driving immense fishing pressure that has greatly reduced their populations. It's the story of a truly global species that requires truly multinational fishery regulations. Each of Paul's books brings stories to life, and in doing so, asks us to think deeply about our role in sustaining our world and the actions we can take to achieve that. Not too long ago, Paul published an article in Adirondack Life magazine. In it, he describes his time working at Brown University as an undergraduate laboratory assistant. He was counting tree pollen grains, a laborious task that demanded hours of time staring into it in a microscope to make those counts. Later on, still in his undergraduate career, he became a field assistant in the Pacific Northwest, counting salmon in streams and doing a habitat inventory. That task requires that he count nearly everything in his view. His article was filled with the characters and settings that so typify his writing. But the real story was that the work all those years ago, the counting, turned out to be as transformational as it was tedious, ultimately convincing him that practicing science as a researcher was, to paraphrase, not going to bring him any closer to the kind of truth he wanted to discover about the natural world or the state of the environment he wanted to save. A bit further along, he writes, and I quote, "In the years since, I spent thousands of hours parsing sentences, talking to scientists, observing while they count, trying to listen and figure out where the signal lies and what's just noise." I'll say that last part again. To listen and figure out where the signal lies and what's just noise. Considering the body of work that Paul has given us over the years, I think I can make a convincing case that our speaker is every bit a scientist and a researcher, but one with very special sets of tools and a voice that is both clear and powerful. As I think about the stories we tell as individuals and organizations, as I think of how our voices fit in the bigger story of protecting and restoring the world and all the communities that share it, I am certain we are very lucky that Paul chose the path that led him here to us today. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Paul Greenberg.
Hello. Hello. Am I live? I just want to make sure. No. Okay, great. Great to see you all today. Thank you so much for having me. Jonathan, that was the best introduction ever done for me. I wish I'm going to maybe ask for it as a recording later on, because writers are forever having very low moments, and I'm just going to hit play in that moment and listen to it. But thank you all. It's great to have you join me here. This is literally the panic room in which I write, and so it's just great to have you here. And I thought I would take this opportunity, this little bit of time that I have with you, to kind of talk a little bit about my process and how I've come to write what I write, why I write with what I write, what are the roadblocks. But I also, you know, I am a teacher at NYU. I've run journalism training programs in the past, and I couldn't help but use this as an opportunity to maybe share some lessons that I've learned about communicating stories over the years. And I thought what I do is kind of use the lens of the books that I've written over the years as the way to kind of bring you along. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. You'll see I'm starting off with this slide. So it's basically a slide saying how to survive in a career in storytelling and change a few minds along the way. And you'll see that I am wearing a survival suit, which when you report aboard a fishing vessel, everyone's required to see if they can shove their body into a survival suit. Needless to say, I was discussing before the Zoom started, I couldn't really get into the survival suit without help. So I probably wouldn't have survived if I had used it. But nevertheless, survival is a really key thing when it comes to being an independent storyteller. And the tricks that I've learned along the way have helped to kind of guide me. So let me take you on a little journey. You know, as Jonathan pointed out, these are the 4 books that I think I'm known for at this point. And it's been, you know, a pretty fun and successful journey. A lot of luck involved. I'm not trying not to toot my horn too much, but this is the kind of media that those books have managed to generate over the years. And the books are also used as part of STEM curricula in a number of different universities around the world. I went to Brown, so you notice I put that front and center and put Harvard off to the side. But so I should say, it is used in a number of different curricula, and I always enjoy having a chance to talk to young people and really finding that young people are really, really receptive more and more to storytelling as a way of bringing science into the world and to conservation into the world. So how did this journey begin for me? Well, it kind of began here. If this was a live audience, I'd ask everyone to raise their hand and let me know who out in the audience has gone fishing, but I have a feeling this is a fairly fishy bunch. I started out fishing largely on divorced dad weekends. My parents divorced when I was 3 years old. And my dad, who's an Upper West Side psychiatrist, really didn't know much about fatherhood. He had this kind of idea, I think, that a father should take his son fishing. And even though he really didn't know anything about fishing, he took me fishing. And what that did is sort of open the door for me to take the lead and for me to learn how to be a fisherman and to kind of show him how to fish. My father remains to this day a terrible, terrible fisherman, but he did sort of open the pathway for me. And so pretty much if you look through my photo albums, there's this whole period of my life in which you will never see a photo of me without a fish. In fact, if I didn't hold a fish, I probably wouldn't pose for the photo, or I would put a bag over my head. So fish after fish, that was sort of the way that I worked my way through life. And, you know, as Jonathan explained, I went through a period of my life where I want to be a field researcher of some kind. I went out to Oregon with the Student Conservation Association. Here's me with a full head of hair and an electroshocker, shocking juvenile salmonids in the Oregon Coast Range. Here's me hauling a canoe through the Midwestern pothole lakes, sampling mud and doing all this kind of thing, and basically being kind of a research slave over the years. And this was like a big moment for me where I wanted to be involved with science. I wanted to be involved in nature, but I just couldn't get over the fact that all I did whenever I worked in science was to count. And I was counting pollen, I was counting salmon, I was counting trees. And I had this idea that I suddenly realized, I had this moment of clarity. Oh my God, if I keep down this path, what's going to happen is I'm going to count all through my 20s, and then maybe I'll go to graduate school and then a postdoc, and maybe I'll have a few counters that I can organize to count. And then a little later, maybe there'll be some counters of counters that I'll organize. And then maybe like by the time I'm my age now in my 50s, I might be able to have a grand theory of all the counting I did. And I just couldn't face it. I just couldn't do it. So I actually left my world of counting and went to Russia in the 90s. I worked for a nonprofit, and this is where I did a lot of my journalism training. I brought Americans over. This was just after the fall of the Soviet Union, to develop an independent network of television stations. And we actually succeeded, but then Vladimir Putin came along and shut them all down. After that, though, is when I really started to find my way back to writing. This is me in Irkutsk, I think. But I found my way back to writing, and I wrote a novel about the whole experience called Leaving Katya. Now, this is a book probably nobody has heard of. It was very important for me, but currently you can find it is 5,726,390th most popular book on Amazon at the present time. So clearly, while I wanted to write, and while I did manage to publish a book, I wasn't necessarily messaging in the way that people wanted to hear. So that brings me to my first fish book, which I never ever expected, by the way, to be a successful book. It was a funny moment, actually, after my novel Leaving Katya didn't really do that well. Not many people were interested from the publishing point of view. I started writing for first the Boston Globe and then the New York Times. And when my book proposal for what would become Four Fish, when it went to auction, there was actually a bidding war, and somebody who had passed on Leaving Katya put in a very low ball bid. And I remember this great moment when my agent said to her, "I'm sorry, Courtney, we're way past that now." So this was like this terrific moment for me. But originally I sold Four Fish as a book called The Fish on My Plate. And I realized that there were so many different fish that you could have on your plate. I remember I came across this statistic that the taxonomic order from which we eat the most from, the order Perciformes, has over 10,000 species. So if I were to have written that book, it would have been called 10,000 Fish. And I think it probably would have been 5 millionth or 6 millionth on Amazon. So have a strong, relatable message is what I realized I needed to do. And so that strong, relatable message actually came from my experience as a fisherman. So when I was a kid growing up, fishing in Long Island Sound, there was just a great multitude of fish that you could choose from. And this was sort of my panoply of fish that I would typically see. When I came back from Russia, that panoply had been greatly reduced to something like this. And these were the fish that I might come across on my fishing trips. So things had really, really radically changed. And when I went to fish markets, I found that things had been even further reduced, because while you might see lots of different kinds of fish at a fish market, there still seemed to be always this sort of leitmotif of four fish again and again. Something white and flaky, your cod; something red and steaky, your tuna; something pink and succulent, your salmon; something sort of whole that you would grill, and that would be called your bass. And I would tell people about this. It's like, oh my God, the ocean is being reduced to just these four essential creatures again and again, and nobody seemed to care. But that's when I realized I had to express it like this, that humans, the average human, does not really care that much about all the species that are out there. What they care about are their flesh archetypes, what they see on their plate. So honing my message down to where I met the consumer, where he or she was at, was really, really key to that. And I was able to show that there was this tie-in to what we've done on land. We used to eat dozens and dozens of mammals as human beings, but telescope to the age of modern animal husbandry, and we're down to four, right? Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs, right? Same with birds. Many, many birds in the sky that we used to eat: chickens, turkeys, ducks, and geese. And then alongside of that, when I was writing Four Fish, I realized like there was this tremendously interesting thing which was going on, which was that we as a species had gone from taking 20 million metric tons of fish from the sea every single year to more than 90 million metric tons from the sea every single year. That's more than the human equivalent of weight of China taken out of the sea every year. And on top of all of that, we started growing fish about 50 years ago, to the point where we now grow more fish than we actually catch. So this huge, epical, crazy shift in human behavior happening right then and there. And so the combination of those four flesh archetypes, the combination of going from essentially wild to half farmed, That was the big structure that I was able to kind of hang this whole thing on. And it became this sort of epic journey through overfishing through all the places in the world. Always starting with fishing right here. Each chapter begins with a fishing trip right here in New York City, but this big global journey that kind of connected my own personal passion for fishing to the global situation of what's going on with fishing around the world. And this worked. It caught on, and it was the cover of the New York Times Book Review. It was a bestseller. It was the book that pretty much put me on the map. But you can't stand still as a writer. You have to put on your survival suit, and how are you going to survive going on into the next chapter of your life? And that's when I realized that you really have to challenge yourself and change the point of view when you go into your next book. So while I wasn't ready to abandon fish altogether as a subject, I realized that I had gotten a lot of letters from fishermen who had read For Fish. They said, there's another story going on here. There's another story going on with American fisheries that you're not paying attention to, and you need to pay attention to it because, in fact, American fisheries have really reformed in the last 15 to 20 years, and that's a story that needs to be told. And so that's the story that I told in this next book, American Catch. And the American Catch story kind of, again, came to me through a personal story. So in 2005, I moved down to the financial district, moved in with my then girlfriend, now partner. And when I moved down there, I thought, gosh, what is this place? It's all full of banks and brokerage firms. Like what's possibly going to connect me to this neighborhood? And that's when I took a walk down to the Fulton Fish Market. And it was 2005, and the Fulton Fish Market was still alive and well. It was this amazing place where I was just exposed to this incredible panoply of creatures coming in from all over the world, but also from right next door. But the next year, it got shut down. The Fulton Fish Market was closed down in 2006 and got moved all the way up to the northern part of the Bronx. I remember talking to a fishmonger in the new Fulton Fish Market. I don't know if anyone on the call has been up to that, but I said, what do you feel about being up here at the new Fulton Fish Market in the Bronx? And he goes, where they put us? Right here, the armpit. And I realized that was a metaphor actually for what has been done to American fisheries in general. Because when you look at it, the United States controls more ocean than any country on Earth, and yet more than 80% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad. I happened to talk to a guy named Herb Slavin, who some of you on the call probably knew or know, started Slavin and Son Seafood, an amazing seafood business. And I remember saying to him, Herb, what do you think of the fact that 80% of the seafood that we eat comes from abroad? He goes, who's the broad? Sorry if that joke falls flat. I'm not sure if it does. It's hard to say when you're doing a Zoom thing. You crack a joke and who's going to laugh, who isn't. But in any case, that was the big question. Like, where is the seafood coming from? Where is it coming from? Who's making it? Why, in a country where we control more ocean than any country on Earth, why is 80% of our seafood coming to us from abroad? And so that led me on this really interesting odyssey. It led me, first of all, to a lot of the great folks who are on the call right here. Here's our buddy, Jim Lodge, over there in Soundview, showing us the amazing stuff that was literally going on as I was starting to work on this book. What was a really great, fortuitous thing was that the Billion Oyster Project was just starting up when I was working on this project. And as a reporter, it's always good to have something actually happening rather than having to look at it in retrospect. So of course, Mark Kurlansky had done great work about oysters, the historical work of oysters, in his great book, The Big Oyster. And that's when I learned that the average New Yorker used to eat 600 locally produced oysters a year up until about 1910 or so. So like within a fairly short period of time, this food system went into a waste disposal system, became a waste disposal system. There's a Yiddish proverb that says, don't poop where you eat. It's a little coarser in Yiddish, I believe, but that is in a sense what we've done to the greater Hudson River estuary. We've turned it into a waste disposal system. So I was able to kind of document the amazing work that Hudson River Foundation, that the Billion Oyster Project, the Harbor School, all these great people doing this great work to bring the oyster back. But in addition to, sort of reclaiming the past and thinking about what we've lost, That book also gave me an opportunity to talk about things we were losing literally at this moment. And that's when I started to become acquainted with this place, which is called Bristol Bay, the biggest, most incredible salmon fishery in the United States, if not in the world. 50 to 60 million salmon coming into this system every single year. And when I started working on this book, this is what was coming down the pike. A huge copper and gold development called Pebble Mine that they wanted to put right there on top of Bristol Bay. And so that became my great passion for a number of years, partially because I was able to witness it firsthand. This is a fly that one uses to fish for rainbow trout in and around Bristol Bay. It's called a flesh fly, and it actually imitates rotting flesh dropping off of a salmon carcass that you use to catch these amazing rainbow trout. And I did manage to catch this rainbow trout right off the dock here in Bristol Bay. This fish, though, was so full of the power of the sockeye salmon that it ate as the flesh fell off its carcass, that the guide couldn't even hold on to it. And it slipped out of his hands, and it kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going. This is not Photoshop. This is like this amazing rainbow trout that was powered by this incredible system, the Bristol Bay system of salmon. So protecting that, trying to save it, that became my passion going forward. And then it also sort of just brought me to this whole question of how can we relocalize our seafood system? And this message really caught on. This op-ed, Why Are We Importing Our Own Fish? That's a whole other story, which I won't go into here, but the fact that we actually send quite a bit of our fish abroad and it comes back to us double frozen. Terry Gross, when I was telling her about this on Fresh Air, was really shocked. She said, "You mean fish comes to us double frozen? My mother told me never to double freeze anything, let alone fish." And it's true. So because of this opportunity to really put this out there about how our local seafood system had been deconstructed, starting with the oysters, going all the way to what was threatening Bristol Bay, I was able to kind of get this message out there. And I think this message actually landed. I was able to get a few grants, one from Walton Foundation that helped me support this whole organization called Local Catch. I didn't start this organization, but was able to fund them, where basically this whole system, what are called community supported fisheries, started to really bloom in the last 10 years. And during COVID, they did extremely well because suddenly it was like, oh my God, the global food chain. Where can I get local fish that I can trust? And yes, there are now this community of community supported fisheries that are doing really great things for relocalizing seafood. So that was those first two books. And then there's another lesson that I think you have to learn when you're kind of trying to tell these stories, which is don't be such a big, important person. Make yourself into a humble character that can pretty much be the bait around which you can form excitement around the thing that you're doing. So, in this case, this was for this book, The Omega Principle. And here I am in my survival suit again. Don't be afraid to be the bait. And I was the bait for this story, and I'll tell you in a second why. But let me tell you the concept of this book. So I had written this book for fish, obviously. But what I wanted to write was about much larger changes that were happening right here in our estuary, but I also write around the world as climate change was affecting the very balance of microorganisms and the very base of the marine food web. So I wanted to write about phytoplankton and all the problems that they might be having as the waters warm. I wanted to talk about forage fish, anchovies, but in particular for the Hudson River, I wanted to talk about menhaden. Those are the very keystone species that drive our ecosystem here. I wanted to talk about krill in the Antarctic and the fact that there was this huge reduction fishery being sent to the Antarctic to scoop up this base of the marine food web and turn it into feed pellets and omega-3 supplements. And I wanted to talk about the disconnection between phytoplankton and zooplankton that seems to be happening as the waters warm and the warming cycles get out of sync with the light system or the light cycles that occur throughout the seasons. So I could have written this book called Four Really Small Things, picking up on four fish, but I realized that nobody would really want to read such a book. And so I ended up focusing on this, the omega-3 supplement. And what's really interesting about the omega-3 supplement, probably, again, I wish I could just ask you all, raise your hands if you've ever taken an omega-3 supplement. I would guarantee you a number of you would say yes. But what's really interesting is that when you Google omega-3s might, or omega-3s may, you get this crazy panoply of things that they might do. Might increase brain volume, might help kids with ADHD, might improve sperm competitiveness. Now, I found this always interesting. I remember I would just blow through the slide typically, and then somebody asked, why would I want my sperm to be more competitive? And, you know, as a man, you're sort of, well, I of course I want it to be the most competitive. But I mean, in general, all these different kind of claims made you really sit up and think, really, is that really true? Why have we been led down this sort of guarded path to think that this might work? And this was my favorite one. Giving children omega-3 fatty acid supplements reduces disruptive behavior, which in turn had a positive effect on their parents, making them less likely to argue with each other and engage in other verbal abuse, finds new randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials. So I just really like that. I thought that was really right on point for how absurd this omega-3 thing was. So as absurd as it is, it's also causing real effects on the marine environment. So we can't just think of it that way. So how is I going to bring a readership to this whole thing? That's when I realized that I had to put myself on the hook and make myself the bait. And how did I make myself the bait? Well, I was 46, 47 at the time that I was writing this book. Though many of you on the call may have had high cholesterol issues, high blood pressure issues. I had all of them. And so these are my actual labs. You know, I guess I should have signed a HIPAA consent form here, but you can see that my cholesterol is going up, and I'm a little concerned, and there's heart disease in my family. What would happen if I went on an all fish diet for a year straight, did my labs at the beginning, did my labs at the end, and in between did this whole giant research trip around the world to see really what's happening with all these reduction fisheries, with these vitamin supplements, all these kinds of things. And again, you know, I think that it worked. This got a lot of attention. The Daily Mail even wrote about me. I mean, this is usually a place for Princess Diana, but something smells a bit fishy. Author eats fish every single day for a year to test the real benefits of omega-3 fatty acids with very surprising results. And then, you know, also I was able to do interesting stuff, kind of provocations to some degree. This is a picture that was taken right at the beginning of my research. I went out with this guy named Jet Ski Jerry. I can't remember his name, but in any case, this guy has these jet ski tours of the Chesapeake Bay, and he took me out jet skiing, and I was able to see these omega-3, there's a huge company that is based in Chesapeake Bay that focuses entirely on menhaden extraction, both for animal feed, both for and also for vitamin supplements. So I was able to actually go out with what's called omega protein, and I was able to go out and catch all this thing. And this is the end of the opening line of the book that I actually got from that moment. On a recent July morning, I stepped aboard a jet ski and set course for a ship that was about to turn 1 million fish into medicine. So that was really, I think, pretty eye-catching, and the industry took note. Pick of author in front of ship fuels fish oil photo flap, which, you know, again, I like these. They're totally cheeseball lines, but I like those kind of things when they happen. It shows that you're kind of breaking into the mainstream, and there was a flap about it, and people did react to it. But at the same time, the people who also reacted to it were politicians, lawmakers, and I think, you know, I'm just one voice of many other voices who got involved in this question of what is happening to all our forage fish. Many of you on the call probably know H. Bruce Franklin's great book, The Most Important Fish in the Sea. I'm internally indebted to him for all the legwork he did. But I think we were able to do some things with this movement. And now, those of you who are fans of Gotham Whale know we've been seeing humpback whales bursting through the waters. And, you know, at first it was just one humpback whale, but I was on the Rockaway boardwalk this summer, and I saw 3 humpback whales working a school of menhaden, in addition to a school of dolphins, in addition to blues and bass breaking through this whole thing. It's just been amazing to see how much more life comes into our waters when there's a lot of menhaden. And I don't know if anyone's been seeing this one, but we had bluefin tuna within sight of land in the greater New York Bight, all feeding on these amazing menhaden that have come back thanks to better legislation and better control of our waterways. So I'm happy to think that I had a small part to play in all this. I think, you know, it's easy to avoid talking about oily little kind of gross fish, but they're actually very, very vital to our waterways. So that was that book. And then, the most recent book that I've done is basically answers this question: give people what they want. And what do people want? They want to know what they can eat. So this most recent book that I wrote is called The Climate Diet. And it was sort of my pandemic book because I couldn't go anywhere. So I really sat down and talked to people about what they could eat, what has the lowest carbon footprint. I talked to a lot of different scientists about what makes for lowest carbon footprint. This big graphic came out of it. Was able to talk about how beef is in fact really impactful. Cheese is actually surprisingly impactful from a carbon perspective. Chicken, actually not so bad, but what really wins out is fish. Is that when you look across all the different species of fish out there that we eat, that you could get to an average of around 1.6 kilograms of CO2 emissions per kilogram of fish that we eat. So that's actually a really good choice. So I was happy to come to that conclusion at the end of writing that book. Going forward, what I'm thinking about doing, it always helps to think around the corner as a writer. So what has been on my mind lately is the interaction between land and sea in the urban environment. The degree to which I spent time at home really influenced how I was going to do things. So I lived down at Ground Zero, as I've told you. I've been developing this garden for the last few years, which I call the Ground Zero Garden. I'm now working on a web show about it, possibly a book on it too, but had these two pretty big media hits recently, one in the New York Times and one in the Guardian. And that has really sort of focused on, I've talked a lot with Paul Mankiewicz, who I'm not sure who's on the call, but great work that he's done about green roofs, the importance of trying to relegate some of that stormwater and retain it in living plant life that also sequesters carbon. So that's very much on my mind going forward. So before I conclude, I just thought I'd throw out a few random tips that might be helpful to you all as you're thinking about communication, since so much of this conference is about communicating stories. So some other random tips I've learned over the years. Be consistent in your branding. I am for Fish Greenberg, even though I'm now doing more climate related stuff, and I will stay for Fish Greenberg. Point of reference is key. I think there's a big movement right now. I don't know if John Waldman's on the call, but he's really inspired me to talk about dam removal. We see these kind of big abstract things about dam removal. Doesn't necessarily move us, but what about this picture, which shows that there are over 3,000 dams in the state of Connecticut alone. This to me is why people in Connecticut are so uptight. Their chi is blocked. Attach your message to something familiar. I've written quite a bit about mercury poisoning. This is a very famous photo that actually broke the story on Minamata disease, this incredibly horrible polluting of the Bay of Minamata in Japan from the Shiseido Corporation. But notice this photograph that is very, very famous, iconic photograph. What is it actually doing? It's actually a Pietà. Drawing from classical art, and it allowed people to really identify with it. Give an opportunity for action in everything you communicate. Those of us in the fishing community realized in the 80s that swordfish were getting exceptionally small. And in fact, actually, they should be much bigger. And that's where one of the great first campaigns of Ocean Kind came into being. Give swordfish a break. Terrific, terrific campaign. Encourage empathy and shared feeling. You can talk all you want, but a straw up your nose, if you're a sea turtle, is going to really get people thinking. One of the most powerful environmental memes of the last few years got people really thinking about plastic waste. Repetition is key. During the Gulf oil spill, that's when my book was having its sort of launchpad moment. And that repetition of that oil spill leaking in the Gulf of Mexico was really, really key going forward to getting people focused on the ocean. And I dare say that Fish would not have been as successful as it became were it not for this ongoing horrible exposure. So I don't want to say that we should repeat the Gulf oil spill, but we do need to think about trying to figure out a way to keep our message in the spotlight. Just sort of randomly, pets often work. When I first started talking about the reduction industry, I wrote this piece for the New York Times, Cat Got Your Fish. The average American cat eats more fish than the average African human. So striking statistic. Holidays and anniversaries also work. During the most recent major anniversary of World War II, I co-wrote this piece with the famous marine ecologist Boris Worm. And we talked about how incredibly potent World War II was for destroying our fish around the world. change your format to keep on messaging, keep your messages going. I have over the years tried to change my formats. I now have a podcast called Fish Talk. I was on Frontline, did my TED Talk, as Jonathan mentioned, and most recently started to write in French. So changing your audience all the time is always a good idea. I'm sorry if I'm rushing, I'm a little over my deadline, but I'm gonna go a little bit further. Make friends with anyone who can spread your message. You know, some people might have some feelings about Dr. Oz. Is he legit or not? Well, I don't care. I went on his show to talk about overfishing, to talk about the different ways that we can eat sustainably. And what about this guy, Donald Trump Jr., who some of you might see him on Instagram. He posted on Instagram how it's so incredible, the sockeye salmon run of Bristol Bay. And I said, oh, isn't it? It is interesting how incredibly abundant that is. Well, maybe you should tell your father about this. And so we put it into an op-ed, me and Carl Safina and Mark Kurlansky and John Waldman. And this got his attention, I believe, because pretty soon he was speaking out against Pebble Mine. And as those of you who follow this issue know, Army Corps recently denied permit for the massive gold mine proposed near Bristol Bay in Alaska. So the last thing I'll leave you with is, these are all a lot of messages, a lot of things to think about. But I will say that in conclusion, that it's really important to remember that we cannot restore what we cannot remember. And if you'll permit me, I'm just going to go a little bit long and read just a short passage from my book, American Catch, because I think it's important to remember that if we can make the past alive and connect it to the present, then we have a chance of restoring our ecosystem. So I'm just gonna read this little passage from American Catch that took place on Bristol Bay, just as this matter was being escalating to becoming what could have been a huge environmental catastrophe. And there you have a great fisherman from a community sport of fishery called Iliamna, who actually sail out of Brooklyn, fishing on Bristol Bay. So passing up to a bluff, I looked down on an isolated little settlement washed by the foam of the Bering Sea and thought that once upon a time, a little 17th century village called New Amsterdam must have looked quite a bit like this. And here's just a picture up in the top. You can see a lithograph of New Amsterdam, the way it looked. And this is the way that Bristol Bay, the fishing settlement in Bristol Bay, looks at this present time. New Amsterdam, a modest place with its face turned toward the sea, where the fisherman and the fishmonger were an integral part of daily life, and where seafood held its own with land food in nearly every regard. What kind of alternative future might America have had if the descendants of New Amsterdam had decided that seafood, not land food, would be the new country's bread and butter? Not a Jeffersonian society that relied upon the harvests of agriculture, nor a Hamiltonian one that captained banking and industry, but rather a Neptunian democracy that lived off the sea. A place where estuaries were recognized as the heart of the food system, where rivers were rarely fettered for fear of impeding the miraculous runs of salmon, sturgeon, shad, and herring, where human development moved in parallel with the protection of the near shore. What kind of society might we have formed had we not, as Melville wrote in Moby Dick, become landsmen, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks? What if instead we had become what Melville called a society fixed in ocean reveries? So that's my talk. Happy to talk a little bit more. Sorry to go a little over there, but I'm happy to take a few questions. And again, thank you so much. And I have to say thank you to the Hudson River Foundation and to all of you on the call, so many of you who have been so helpful in my research over the years. And it's great to be in touch with you again.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that inspiring talk. I wanted to let you know that the attendees, the number just passed 500. So that inspiration is reaching many, many people this morning. Great. I think that's really terrific. I want to invite everyone who's on the call today, on the Zoom call through Whova, to put some questions in your chat. They'll get transferred to us here on this technology. We're using two different technologies today. And so we can relay some of those to Paul and get some of his answers. So I'm going to start with maybe a tough question, but it's one that I think, I think listening to you today and reading your works, I come back to the word trade-offs. and how to inform people about trade-offs. You talk about food systems, and that's a hot term these days in agriculture and in the research community. And it's complex, it's difficult. So talk to us a little bit about the trade-offs in food systems, the need to feed lots of people, particularly in urban environments, and how we can communicate about food systems and the particular value of marine, estuarine, freshwater systems.
Yeah. Well, I think a real obvious one is the question of fishing, right? Because fishing is this extractive thing that we do. And I'm wondering, again, I wish I was in the room, people would raise their hands, but how many people have seen the film Seaspiracy? Probably quite a few of you. It's one of the few things that really broke through in the fishing front on an international level. And that movie, leaves you with this message: don't eat fish. And it's Sylvia Earle has said this very clearly again and again: don't eat fish, just don't eat fish. Well, I would argue that as soon as we stop seeing the oceans as a food system, that just what happened to us in New York City, where we made basically the Hudson River estuary into a waste disposal system, that it's likely to happen to the oceans again at large. So I think that we can't be so blanketly dismissive of fishermen. Yes, they are extractive. Yes, they're going to have an impact on our ecosystems. But at the same time, if they're not there, if we're having no participatory relationship with the oceans, either right next door or further at sea, then I don't see how there's an economic incentive to keep the oceans clean. There's a great guy named Carter Newell who runs the Pemaquid mussel and oyster operation up in Maine. He once said to me, and again, this is more farming than fishing, but he once said to me, shellfish farming is the economic argument for clean water. Now think about it, that's really powerful, right? Because, okay, yes, I loved the slide earlier that Rosana showed of people swimming in the Hudson River estuary, and swimmable and fishable is of course keystone of this. And I circled Governor's Island on a 2-mile swim once, so I know swimming is good. But are you going to pay to swim in the ocean? I mean, a few of us will, but will we pay to eat safe mussels, safe oysters, safe clams? Yes, we will. And so by giving those people our vote of confidence, not just a vote, but our economic participation, I think we can justify whatever extraction is going on, provided that the people who are harvesting from the ocean are also, giving back in the form of being stewards, being guardians, and keeping public policy people aware of the kind of stuff that could potentially destroy the ocean as a food system.
Just a follow-up to that, and then we have a question from the audience.
Yeah.
There's probably been forever a raging debate within the fisheries world about the concept of sustainable fishing, sustainable fisheries. And they're deeply entrenched sides on that. Can you talk a little bit about that, the concept of sustainable fisheries?
Sure. I think that there's this big scientific definition of it, which is MSY, maximum sustainable yield. And that is a concept that's come under fire from conservationists most recently. But the concept of MSY is very straightforward. It's kind of like a bank account, that you have this principle of fish, of breeding fish, and every year they produce a certain surplus, the interest, if you will, on your bank account, and then you harvest that, and then you don't harvest too much, or else you're going to eat it to your principal. And if you do a good job, then you'll get it replaced the next year. Problem with that, obviously, is that ecosystems are complex, and just sort of taking what we want out of the system and not thinking about what other creatures might need from those same fish is short-sighted. So there's been a big push in the last few years for what's called ecosystem-based management, which is a little bit of a hard thing to define, actually. What are the needs of the different creatures out there? How do we balance that in such a way? But I think it is driving some of our work around menhaden. So it's not just extracted for the purposes of production, but we're also starting to think about what whales need, what porpoises need, what all these other stakeholders, if you will, that don't have voices bring to the table. So I think moving towards a more ecosystem-based management process is important, but also, then there's the question of what is like, what does sustainable mean over and above biological sustainability? There's also a question of, can our coasts continue to be working coasts? And when I say working, I don't mean industrialized. I mean, can we have, instead of just having condo developments up and down our most beautiful shorelines, can we still have fishing villages? Can we still make fishing economically feasible and participatory, and in a way that is not at odds with all the people who would like to see just more and more real estate development on those coasts? So I think it's a multifaceted thing. You know, we hear at the UN quite a bit this question of the triple bottom line. I think it's environment, economic, and I'm blanking on the third, but somebody in the audience can. But in short, there are many bottom lines to think about when we're thinking about sustainability. And personally, I'm in favor of having fishing communities. I'd like to see them more brought into the conservation conversation. And it worked in Bristol Bay. I mean, look at Bristol Bay. That was a situation where, you know, in the past, sport fishermen and conservationists and commercial fishermen have all been at odds. But when this mortal threat to all of them came in the form of Pebble Mine, they came together and effectively opposed that horrible golden copper mine.
You know, there are a couple of examples where ecosystem-based management, fisheries management has beginning to work. You know, Alaska is one of them, in the Bering Sea. But again, as you said, these are not static ecosystems. They're not static in environment. They're not static socially. And we need to recognize that another overused term of adaptive management, ecosystem-based management is all pinned on managing adaptively over time.
That's right. That's right. And I was just working on a story for Eating Well magazine about lobsters in the Gulf of Maine. And, you know, as you all know, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than any body of water, I think, in the Northern Hemisphere. Lobsters, we used to have lobsters. I mean, Gravesend used to produce enough lobsters for the entire city of New York. And then more and more lobsters came from Long Island Sound, and then they came from further. And then in the 90s, we lost Long Island Sound lobster pretty much altogether, at least in the western part of the Sound. So that now our lobsters primarily are coming from Maine, but now we're starting to see that, you know, that fishery creep north. And, you know, and you know, we're seeing in the traps instead is black sea bass, more and more black sea bass, which for Maine, they don't even have a quota a lot of times for black sea bass. So it's, you know, it's you're absolutely right. It has to be adaptive, and, you know, let's keep us on our game. You know, it used to be, if this were 30 years ago, where there was no big data, where there was no ability to kind of, with no AI to help us, you know, figure these things out. Okay, but we have the tools. We can be adaptive.
Let me take a question from the audience. John Young Park asks, says that he remembers about how Asian farm shrimps are flooding into American food culture. I want to hear your opinion about artificial shrimp ponds replacing existing mangrove forests.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, so shrimp is the most consumed seafood in America by far. 4 pounds of shrimp per person per year. Overall, we eat 15 pounds per person per year in the United States. So nearly a third of it is shrimp. Shrimp represent a number of challenges. Shrimp have a fairly primitive immune system, so that if you get an infection in a shrimp pond, you pretty much have to abandon it, or that's at least the way it used to be. Now, this is problematic because shrimp are primarily grown in areas that are dominated by mangrove forests. So to have a shrimp farm, you have to clear out the mangroves, you put the shrimp in. If a disease breaks out, the pond is abandoned, more mangroves are cleared out. I should say, in a nod to the shrimp industry, they've gotten better at this. They've gotten better at pond management, but we still lost millions and millions of acres of mangrove forests. Now, why is this important? Mangrove forests are extremely good as coastal protectors. And I know, you know, oysters are this way as well. And I know, I don't know if Kate Orff is on the call, but those of you who are familiar with the term oyster texture know that there is this process and this possibility of trying to get natural systems to protect our shorelines from flooding. Mangroves are really key to that and could be really key to that going forward. But the other thing is that mangrove forests are extremely good sequesters of carbon. By some metrics, mangroves sequester 4 times as much carbon dioxide as tropical rainforests. So losing 1 acre of mangrove forest is like losing 4 acres of tropical rainforest. So extremely vital ecosystem that we have to preserve. And just for the sake of shrimp, I don't know, is it really worth it? I always say one big swap. People ask, what can we eat? here's a good one that you could take away. Swap your cocktail for your half shell. Have oysters in half shell instead of shrimp cocktail. By the way, we go into the shrimp thing pretty deeply in my podcast, Fish Talk, in the first episode. The first episode is called Goldilocks and the Three Shrimp. And on that episode, we try farm shrimp, a wild shrimp, and a vegan shrimp, which is now hitting the market just as we speak.
So a good follow-up question. Helena Andreyko from the foundation asks, regarding the carbon footprint of various foods, what was the difference between farm-raised versus wild-caught fish?
Very good question, tricky question. The folks at UC Santa Barbara have been trying to get to the bottom of this question. It varies quite a bit. The biggest component of farmed fish carbon emissions is the feed, because it's a combination of wild fish that are caught usually in Chile or Peru and then sent all over the world to be processed. And then on top of that is a lot of soy and corn, which are both pretty carbon intensive crops, not anywhere near as carbon intensive as, say, like asparagus, but carbon intensive. So it's hard to get a hard, fast thing, but after looking at a lot of different graphs, my sense was that farmed fish hovered somewhere between pigs and chicken. That is like somewhere between 5 and 10 kilograms of carbon emissions per kilogram of food. Whereas I said in my graphic, 1.6 kilograms for overall wild fish. Now, there's big differences between wild fish. A bottom trawled flounder, where you're dragging a trawl along the bottom and literally pulling against it with your vessel, is going to cost you a lot of carbon. Whereas a midwater trawl that is going after, say, Alaska pollock, which, by the way, is in your filet fish sandwich, or Peruvian anchoveta, are extremely carbon efficient, like much better than almost anything out there. I think some work at the University of Washington said that the most carbon efficient in terms of nutrients per unit of carbon meal that you could have would be something having to do with carrots and anchovies. And I actually recently did that as a cooking demo for this conference called Concrete Love in Portugal, and actually live cooked my version of carrots and anchovies. And if somebody is curious about that recipe, tag me on Twitter at 4fishgreenberg, and I'll see if I can put the recipe up.
Changing tacks a little bit. You mentioned dams a little while ago, and for anyone who's looked at the issue of small scale dams, particularly in New England, but throughout the United States, there's an overwhelming number of dams.
Yeah.
And the reality is it's an overwhelmingly complex issue.
Yes.
And people are on the driven to extremes around dams. They've been part of the fabric of communities for a long time. They have severe and long-term impacts on the river ecosystems where they're placed. How do you communicate in that space? How do you communicate when it's so contentious, where there are benefits, huge benefits to removing dams? There are community benefits to keeping them. How do you communicate in that contested area?
It's tough. I think some of the best people around that issue, the Nature Conservancy in Connecticut has done really, really great work. Steve Gephardt of DEEP in Connecticut, working to get in concert with the Nature Conservancy. They've just did amazing work. And I did a story actually about a dam removal on the Jeremy River, which feeds into the Salmon River, surprise, surprise, which feeds into the Connecticut. And it was really interesting. I think the best thing that works the best in Connecticut was to confront landlords or dam owners with their potential liability, because this sort of matriarch of this old Connecticut milling family, they weren't really making anything with this dam anymore. They did all sorts of things over the years. They powered a factory that made heels for shoes. It's very Dr. Seussian need, like, all these things that get used for. Basically Steve and the Nature Conservancy rep, they sat down with this woman, Nan Wisniewski, and was like, look, this dam goes, you're going to get a surge of water. You got property owners here and here and here and here. You're potentially on the line for millions and millions of dollars. So take a look at this. Now, there's been other situations where, so I did a story about dam removal on the Boquete River up in the Adirondacks, where it's a dam on the Boquete is one of the major impediments to huge amounts of salmon spawning area. Those of you who aren't familiar with it, salmon, many salmon have a landlocked variety. I think all salmon do. And there's a landlocked salmon in Lake Champlain that could be reestablished as a wild run were the upper reaches of places like the Boquete open to spawning. So there was a very, very iconic mill pond that had been there for years. Everyone thought it was sort of gorgeous. They like to look at the ducks. But people who started to persuade people that this could potentially be really important talked about the value of sport fishing. Like if you could establish a world-class salmon fishery, all the dollars in tourism that would bring to this very depressed Adirondack community eventually convinced people. And the dams went out, and we've been seeing, and there's been some successful spawning, and it's really exciting. It's kind of in a way replacing one archetype in your brain with another. Like, would you like to see a still, quiet mill pond with swans on it, or would you like to see salmon rushing up the river, and forming reds and doing all this kind of stuff? So it requires people. Again, this comes back to storytelling. You can't restore what you can't remember. You have to plant people in their image, in their mind, what a healthy river actually looks like.
That's great. A question from Rob Pirani. The ability to safely consume fish in the river and the estuary has been compromised by legacy toxins. How do we encourage fishing while appropriately messaging about risk, particularly in our neighborhoods who rely on subsistence fishing?
It's a huge, huge question. And, I often fudge that question by saying I'm neither a woman nor I'm neither a child nor a woman of childbearing age. I'm sort of an aging white guy. So sadly, like often in society, I can kind of eat from the area and not feel like I'm going to poison a child or whatever. So, okay, so that's a fudge. I think that it is truly, we have to be really sensitive about our children and about women of childbearing age. We really have to focus on that. I think that there is some work to be done I don't think we actually have enough science to understand when things improve, at what point does the fish get safer? It's just like these kind of hard edge things like, boom, don't eat it, that's it. I'm often think about like striped bass, for example. A lot of people say, oh, striped bass, I wouldn't eat a striped bass from the Rockaways. It's, who knows where it's been. But on the other hand, striped bass are highly migratory. They're moving, up and down the coast. You don't quite know where that striped bass has been. So I guess, there is always the focus on eating smaller fish rather than having big bruising fish. The fact that there's now a slot limit on striped bass where you can't eat a fish larger than 36, you can't keep a fish larger than 36 inches. That's probably going to be a little bit helpful in keeping these, highly toxic accumulated fish off the plate. I think you need to be aware of it, but I would say actually, and this is, I think, a really big point. One thing I'm always struck by is the lack of signage in other languages all over the Hudson River estuary, not just about toxicity, but also about what are the regulations. And oftentimes I'll see immigrant communities catching, keeping illegal sized fish. And the purist in me wants to say, oh, you don't know anything. You can't keep a striped bass that size. But how would they know? There's no signage in Mandarin. There's no signage in Cantonese. There's no signage in Portuguese or Russian or whatever. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would say, let's put signage everywhere in the dominant languages of the New York Bight, so we could at least begin a dialogue about this.
That's great. Paul, I want to thank you. We're coming to the end of our time, but I want to thank you once again for inspiring us, for teaching us, for all the work that you continue to do on these important issues. I couldn't think of a better person to kick this conference off today. You are not just a storyteller, you're a scholar of fish and fisheries and food systems. So I, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, and have a great and wonderful conference, and let's all meet on the water next year.
All right. We're going to go to a short break in a minute. I want to encourage everyone to come back at 11 o'clock for our next session. And it promises to be as interesting as Paul's, and to join us for the rest of the meeting over the course of the week. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you all again in about 15 minutes.